I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but talking about Palestine, Israel, and the United States. The question is, why does the US support Israel unreservedly? With a question mark. If I'd drawn up the question, I'd have lost the first word, why. Does the United States support Israel unreservedly? Well, of course, it has until now. Every US president has supported Israel unreservedly so far. Barack Obama was hated by Benjamin Netanyahu, though it's hard to see why. He must have been responding to Obama's earlier words and thoughts rather than his actions. Donald Trump had the most fabulous love affair, a ménage à trois, with Israel and Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf states. That was, in a way, the perfect marriage for the Americans. The point I'm making, and not my guests and maybe not all of my audience will agree with, is that the United States does not work for Israel, but Israel works for the United States, and therefore it cannot be unreservedly. Let me give you an example. Israel does not want the United States to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. The previous Prime Minister of Israel, at least, and maybe the next one, wanted to attack Iran and destroy its nuclear facilities. But the United States would not sanction such an act, which would undoubtedly have led to a much wider regional war, which Israel itself might have paid a severe price for. So it can't be unreservedly, in my view, because the United States has interests, and the imperial system that it heads, seen most recently in the G7 meeting in England, and those interests have up until now coincided with the interests of Israel, but may, in theory, not always do so. Certainly, whether reservedly or unreservedly, the support is simply enormous. Billions of dollars every year are transferred from the United States taxpayer to the arsenals of the Israeli occupation force. And they have the gall to ask for another billion on top to replace the weaponry they used to kill 200 Palestinians in Gaza, half of them women and children. I don't know if they'll get the extra billion. It hardly matters. If you add the gigantic subvention from private American sources to Israel, then for a small country of only 5 or 6 million people, it is one hell of a lot of money, and it ensures Israel's military superiority, at least in the air and at least in defensive terms. It is a moot point, I would argue, that it is a point that I would contest is proven, that Israel does not have the capacity to fight on the ground against either the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. That's why they made no ground invasion, despite earlier signaling one. They do not have the ability to fight on the ground the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah. They can defend their state more or less intact, but they cannot further rule other people. The days of occupation of, for example, the south of Lebanon are very definitely over and will never come back. Some people in Israel are anxious about the number of Palestinian resistance rockets that landed in Tel Aviv, that landed at Ben Gurion Airport, penetrating the so-called Iron Dome. And they openly speculate what would have happened if not only the Lebanese resistance had begun firing rockets into Israel, but the Iraqi resistance had done so, as they said that they were ready to do. How well would the Iron Dome have worked? Certainly, it's true that Israel is a nuclear-armed military superpower, backed by the world's nuclear-powered hyperpower. That really takes care of your security, and yet Israel's security is the narrative in Western countries that we most frequently hear about. Israel has the right to defend itself, they say, though that's not a right they seem prepared to extend to the Palestinians living under their illegal military occupation. My last point is this. Opposition to American endless largesse to Israel is beginning to grow in the United States, amongst young Jewish people and amongst young politicized people across all faiths and none. There are now people in the US Congress ready to say words that were never said before in the hallowed halls of the American Congress. Words like apartheid, apartheid state. The calling of Israel what it is can now be heard relatively routinely on the floor of the House of Representatives, and even occasionally, very occasionally, in the Senate. Now, the people who say these words are, for now, a minority in the Democratic Party, but they are a growing minority, and ultimately, the leadership of the Democratic Party may have to pay some attention to them. So my answer to my own question is that the US does not support Israel unreservedly, although its reserved matters are very, very loosely drawn and have not yet been reached. Let's hear from my distinguished audience of experts. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur here. Dr. Ghada Karmi is the expert of all experts. She is Palestinian, from Jerusalem. She lectures in Arab and Islamic studies at the University of Exeter. She's a commentator of the highest rank. And of course, being a Palestinian and a lady, she gets the first word. Dr. Ghada, welcome to the show. What's your answer to that question? Why does the US support Israel unreservedly?
Let me just say, I think that the answer to this question is not simple. I honestly don't think it's a question of, well, let's put it another way. There are two schools of thought on this. On the one hand, something that accords with your view, that Israel fits in to US imperial world order, and that Israel serves the interests of the United States and does all kinds of things for it which would not be appropriate for the US to be seen to be doing. For example, it partners pretty dodgy, unsavory regimes in South America and Africa, and does the United States bidding without saying so overtly, and so on. Now, the second school of thought says it's the Israel lobby. There is a very powerful lobby operating against the political process in the United States, actually has taken it over and dictates American policy on the Middle East. And there's a lot of evidence, a lot of support for that point of view. I tell you, I'm puzzled because I don't know that it's this thing or that thing entirely. And one of my problems with the thesis that says that Israel is a servant of US imperialism is very simple. It's it's very simply this. If you need a servant to do things for you, you can either pay the servant $1,000 a month, or you can pay the servant $1 million a month. Now, why would you pay that servant $1 million a month when you could get their services for much less than that? So my first problem with the imperial theory is that if that is the case, the United States is paying way over the odds to get these services from Israel. So you have to ask yourself, why so much? You can support it, yes, it can be your client, but to this extent? So I think that's a quite important question. If we look at the lobby issue, I really have to say it's pretty persuasive, the power of the lobby. The lobby has infiltrated every area of the American system. There's no doubt that given the way that money plays such an important part in American elections, in American political policy and actions, money is used by the lobby to buy these things, to buy members of Congress, to buy politicians in order to promote Israel's case. We have many, many illustrations of this point. So I'm inclined to feel that on the one hand, yes, Israel does fulfill some roles for the United States, particularly in the Cold War, for example.
Isn't its most important role to keep the Arabs divided and weak and to maintain military and to some extent political hegemony over them for the empire?
Yeah, I know this theory as well. But you know, I'll tell you something. People forget. The Arabs, by and large, and obviously a big generalization, are very pro-American. You know, they're not communists. They're not socialists longing to be close to Russia. They are actually very receptive to American culture, to the American message. It wouldn't have taken that much work to keep them on side. Could you argue that the amount of effort they've put in to support this state, which everybody hates, frankly, as opposed to being nice to the Arabs?
Interesting thesis.
Yes.
One last question, which maybe challenges where I think you're leaning to. In Britain, money is not nearly such an important thing in politics, and yet half of all Labour MPs are self-declared friends of Israel, and Israel didn't have to pay very much at all to secure that allegiance. And 75% of Conservative members of Parliament are also self-declared friends of Israel. So we've got a lobby here which doesn't cost Israel anything at all.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Remember, it's late in the day. This country was disliked by the Israelis for many years because it was seen as the home of pro-Palestinian messages, Palestinian support, Palestinian solidarity. Quite recently, in the last few years, coinciding with the ascent of Jeremy Corbyn, which I think is not a coincidence, the efforts of the lobby have redoubled in order to intimidate and frighten politicians. So it's a little bit, it's a more nuanced story.
Well, when I entered Parliament nearly 35 years ago, the Foreign Office was widely regarded as Arabist. They had a love of the desert and an imagined Arab reality, and the Israelis used to regularly traduce them as Arabist. Now, Alan Duncan, the former Foreign Office Minister, whom Israel tried to bring down, says the Israelis think they own the British Foreign Office, and they do. Mohsen Abbas, what's your take on the US-Israel special relationship?
I think it seems to me to divide into two eras or two periods. It's quite clear that during Eisenhower's time and prior to that, the Americans weren't exactly overt pro-Israelis. That's clear in their policies. Even the sinking of the US ship, which got covered up back then by the Israelis, blasted by the Israelis. Such major incidents, whilst they didn't break the relations, they did sort of indicate that actually all was not well. So I think that Cold War period, when Israel arguably was a linchpin for the Americans to keep an eye on the Middle East and to protect their economic interests, the oil interests. Let's not forget that the dollar was pretty much tied to oil, increasingly so after Nixon. But these subtleties that were going on in the background, I think they show that there wasn't an absolute carte blanche for Israel by the Americans, certainly not prior to that Cold War session. I think as time's gone on, the Israelis have strengthened their grip through the lobby groups, through IPAC, through various other, and very importantly also through a very clever technique, I think, that was employed, which they latched onto, which existed prior to the Zionist movement in America. That was the Christian Zionist inclination and the movement. There is a huge support amongst Christian fraternities of that ilk in America that actually are probably the main bulwark of support for the Jewish lobbies, or if you're the Jewish side.
Well, for the Israeli lobby, as a matter of fact, theologically, they don't like Jews very much at all.
No.
They're trying to hurry along Armageddon, at which point the Jews will have to convert or be killed.
Well, the scriptures, according to them, say that the Jews have to be back in Israel, in the Holy Land, in order for the Armageddon to begin. So far, they're saying we support because they obviously want this Armageddon, which is a bizarre kind of eschatology to really follow through. But it does impact American politics. It has impacted American politics. And I think rather than just concentrate on the Jewish Zionist lobby in America, this is an important factor in changing that perspective in American politics and the American public, because don't forget, the American public itself overwhelmingly has been supporting Israel and supporting the whole concept around Israel. However, that's changing. There are discernible movements within the political spectrum, not only amongst mainstream America, but also amongst the Jewish youngsters, or who are presumably labeled as Zionists. But there is an inclination to disassociate with especially what's going on in Israel's right-wing, increasingly right-wing political makeup. That in America, certainly the Democrats increasingly more uncomfortable, I feel. I think that there is the difference between Biden internally and what Trump was doing. Trump and the Republicans just increasingly went for that right-wing policy. They've in fact caused even more of a problem for Israel, I think, because what they did was declared Jerusalem the capital. They acknowledged it as a Jewish state. They acknowledged the Golan Heights as being, a part of Israel. And so Biden now subtly, you'll see that the State Department has recently just actually re-acknowledged that those territories, which Trump was saying were basically part of Israel, they've now labeled them as occupied territories, once again.
Disputed, I think.
Disputed
territories. Thank you, Mohsen. Syed Inayatullah Andrabi is a commentator on current affairs, political Islam, the Islamic movement, and so on. Do you think that Joe Biden unreservedly supports Israel? I myself do not think that.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yeah. I feel comfortable that I agree with you. We are conducting the panel this time, and I, in a fundamental way, agree with you that Israel is using USA and not vice versa. But I have a stronger version of it, and I should refer to my Urdu videos. 2 videos now on YouTube, on internet, on which I have precisely discussed this thing, because this was in response to a narrative which is growing popularity and which is made popular in Pakistan, India, in Muslim communities, with reference to the eschatological realities of Jews managing the world, of Jews being the masters of the world. And this narrative is creating problems in the cause of Islam, the political Islam. Because I must say this also, that I'm living here, and I know British Empire and Western civilization, and I will refer to an old saying of a king called King Porus, who went to India. He was ruling India when Alexander the Great went to India. Porus was defeated. And when Porus was defeated, Alexander asked him, "How should I treat you?" He told him, "As a king treats king." So my ego, my consciousness is of a Muslim who has a global political agenda. And I treat Western civilization as someone at par with me, with whom I should be honest, with whom as a king treats the king. So I must tell you that Western civilization and the political system they have perfected all these 300-400 years is excellent, ingenious. They won't allow lobbies to disrupt their basic strategic objectives. They have a clear strategic vision and they want to live. So I say that in the imperial game, let me briefly define it. Although it started with Spanish and Portuguese, those colonial loots, it culminated with Industrial Revolution with an excellent strategic vision of Britain. And Britain, they established a formidable empire. And at the moment, the empire has gone, but the colonial control hegemony is very much there. And I call it an Anglophile empire. The political and military center has shifted across Atlantic after World War II, and America has taken control of it, and it's basically the hegemony control. In the process of it, if you see, I will refer to the Bannerman document, Henry Bannerman document, which has been there with the colonial conferences of 1905 till 1907. It was in the process that they thought that region of the Arab world, which is united by religion, language, culture, everything, they could get united at any time. And placing an alien entity there, a hostile entity, which is overtly, covertly opposite to Islam, Muslims, everything, but very loyal to Britain and these people, it would be in the fitness of things. And I will go a bit further. I won't say it fits in. Israel fits in the imperial game. I will say Israel was brought and fitted in.
Yes.
Yeah, it was fitted in. It's not an incident and
No, it's
chance.
not.
No,
I don't think.
it was fitted in.
Yeah.
And Israel
But the
was
Brit-
always considered as a forward post by these people.
Exactly.
And these words have been used.
They were used by the British. That
Yeah,
it would
by
be
Brit-
like a loyal British Ulster
Forward post.
in the Middle East. Much more of this after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, discussing Palestine and its special relationship with the United States. We caught up on his way to a Palestine demonstration with Mick Napier, the head of Scotland's Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Mick, why do all US administrations prioritize support for Israel?
Israel's a nasty little Sparta, a little militarized Prussia in the Middle East, which acts as a colonial settler state tied intimately to the USA and Europe. It acts as a policeman of last resort for the region. Any government which behaves in a way which the empire disapproves of, one of the major tools in the toolbox is that Israel can attack. There may be all sorts of costs in terms of local anger, hatred of the empire and so on, but the empire doesn't need to be loved, it just needs ultimately to be feared. And Israel has a record of intervening in Lebanon, in Syria, certainly attacking Egypt many times, in order to discipline regimes which are not fully on message with Washington or for that matter, Brussels. So it's a strategic alliance. Britain, of course, was the dominant power and used the Zionist movement in order to secure, quote, what the first Governor General of conquered Jerusalem, Ronald Storrs, called a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism, by which he meant the settler colonists, not the native Palestinian Jews who had lived in harmony with their fellow Palestinians for a very long time, but the incoming Zionist Jews, by dispossessing the natives, would incur the wrath of the individuals and by the rising national movement. And in order to survive as a tiny minority initially, they would be forced to rely on the then dominant power, the British. So just as Scottish and English loyalists in Northern Ireland were forced into this alliance, which was unbreakable with Britain in earlier centuries, the alliance with the Zionist movement and Britain was unbreakable until the Second World War. Each needed the other in order to, one, dominate the region, and secondly, simply to survive. Without imperial protection, the early Zionist movement would have been brushed aside by local people.
Do you think it's true that the Israel lobby controls both the parties in the United States?
I think control is too strong a word. They can certainly strongly influence it. They can raise the cost of certain policy moves, but if push comes to shove, then I don't think the tail wags the dog. The Americans are interested. I mean, take for example, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, of course, a monster in many ways, but Biden follows roughly the same rules. Donald Trump, initially when he ran for office, was very critical of Israel, talked about withdrawing aid and so on. It didn't do his electoral prospects any harm at all. What he did was he wanted Sheldon Adelson's money and other Jewish billionaires' money. And in order to get that money, he switched and became Israel's most reliable man in Washington. So it's not about the Jewish lobby. It's not about the Jewish population. The great majority vote Democrat and can't be relied upon to support a government like Netanyahu's. But the relationship between access to billionaire money and political careers is very, very important. So I think that the lobby is very powerful, no doubt about it, but I don't think it controls American foreign policy. I think it's much more like one of those pilot fish who swim ahead of a giant shark. They don't tell the shark where to go. They position themselves in order to best serve American foreign policy, in order to best serve the shark, but it's the shark that decides where it goes and where those pilot fish will follow.
Now that the US is actually a major oil exporter itself, its energy needs are changing, the demand for oil falling irrevocably. Is that likely to lead to a diminution in US support for Israel?
No, I think it's very dangerous. I think if you look back to the Vietnam War, when America was being defeated by the Vietnamese people, the invasion, the death of 3 million and so on, but ultimately American militarism suffered a crushing defeat. That was one of the reasons why Nixon and other presidents decided fewer Americans would die and he would support Israel in the Middle East. So I think the current situation where Biden and others are orienting towards confronting China, a very dangerous situation, and pulling down their investment in the Middle East, I think that's even more dangerous because they will subcontract more of the policing of the region to Israel. And I think the link between Israel and America will remain horribly strong.
Dr. Rada, in a way, Mick Napier there was making my point, although maybe unconsciously. You would have said 20 years ago, maybe 10, that Britain's commitment to Ulster, to Northern Ireland, that it had settled for precisely the reason Mick Napier said, with Scottish and English settlers, was unreserved support. but actually the British government has just sold out Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is not much longer for the map. It has drawn a line down the middle of the Irish Sea and said, okay, that's the border. They've been ready to sacrifice their own settlers because it no longer suits the imperial needs. I suppose in a way that's the point I'm making about the United States-Israel relationship.
Look, first of all, the sort of thing that Mick Napier was talking about was certainly true in the way that Israel was set up. The imperial usefulness that it was seen to be providing or could potentially provide to Britain was uppermost in the mind of the British government for supporting the creation of Israel. And indeed, you know, when the question was handed over to the United States, or the United States took it on, same ideas, the idea. But you see, it's not as simple as that. Israel is independent. It grew up to regard itself as having interests which don't always coincide with those of its creators and its supporters. So there's that to be reckoned with. And we know that from the passing on of weapons secrets to the Chinese, of American, weapons technology to the Chinese. They wouldn't hesitate, Israel wouldn't hesitate to sell its master down the river if it suited Israel. What's got to remember, these things that imperialism created have their own agendas, and in the end, they do what they think is good for them. So it's not that I'm discounting, I think I tried to say earlier, not at all the point of view that says Israel serves Western imperial designs, etc. Of course it does. But it doesn't, in my view, it doesn't entirely explain the fantastic support and power of Israel over the American political process, over the situation in Europe. Let's forget, people are terrified of being accused of anti-Semitic. Who created that? Israel, in order to protect itself. So it's not really an either or. And you know, there is something else that needs to be said. Those same imperial powers we're talking about do have some red lines. There are things that they will not allow Israel to do. For example, the first Gulf War, when Israel was kept right out of the picture because of the anxiety that it would evade control and do its own thing. That was not going to be allowed, and that happened. So it's not as if I'm arguing that the United States or Europe has absolutely no way of not acceding to every single thing that Israel wants. It's just the extent of this, you see. This is what puzzles me. It's too much to be able to explain it on these perfectly reasonable
utilitarian grounds. Fair point. Said Andrabi, is Israel a Frankenstein monster that got out of control and is beyond the control of the Dr. Frankenstein who made it, or is Dr. Frankenstein still in charge?
Yeah, Frankenstein is still in charge, and this is this equation of who controls whom, or the controlled entity Israel in this Israel as we are discussing, whether they outgrow, they become actors in their own right. This can be extended to so many other situations. This analogy has been used in explaining U.S.-Pakistan relations or U.S.-Arab relations. But if I bring up another point about this, the establishment of Israel, originally made by Dr. Kaleem Siddiqui, late Kaleem Siddiqui, here the director of Muslim Institute, he said after the Balfour Declaration, what was done was the Zionist movement was strengthened and armed and made a terrorist organization. Jews were brought and they came to Palestine, and a neighborhood was created. Hashemite kingdom, Al Saud, This was a neighborhood which would provide security to Israel. Only at the end of the process, in 48, the state was established of Israel, not before that, because it could not survive without the neighborhood. Now, the peace of the neighborhood has been decisively and irreversibly disrupted by the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Things have changed. Although governments have not changed, but things on the ground have changed. There was a poll some years before when Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran. The most popular person in Arab world was Ahmadinejad at that time. The people who are the common Muslims. So the things have changed, and this has made a problem for Israel. That, as you might have noted, everybody has noted, that this time Israel could not get the support it was expecting.
No, and public opinion support for Israel fell dramatically in all countries.
Yes, and that was because that Israel's usefulness is day by day coming down.
That's my point. Let's cross to the United States, to Washington. Professor Walter Hickson is a contributing editor at the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, the author of several books on the subject. Professor, welcome. Professor, why do all American administrations prioritize supporting Israel?
Well, Israel, there's a affinity within the United States for the Jewish state since its inception, which is partly rooted in history, partly rooted in the fact that at the time of Israel's creation, the United States had the largest Jewish population in the world, and obviously in the wake of the Nazi genocide, there was a great deal of sympathy and interest in the Zionist movement and state. But over the decades, the reason that Israel is as powerfully supported and unquestionably supported by the United States has a great deal to do with the actions of the most powerful lobby representing a foreign country in all of American history, and that is the Israel lobby.
Why does the US public accept the huge sums of money that the taxpayer sends over to Israel in finance and also in military and other technical aid?
Well, a lot of that is just ignorance of it, and the discourse is heavily policed by the lobby, especially in Washington. But the fact of the matter is that Israel, a small state, 7,000 miles or so from American shores, is by far and away the most heavily supported financially foreign country. Yet the United States continues to just pump out $3.8 billion annually to support this militarized aggressor state in the Middle East. So a lot of Americans just aren't aware of that. Virtually no one, just a few people, the so-called squad progressives like Bernie Sanders, speak out against it. So it is so heavily policed by AIPAC, the main lobby organization in Washington, that general knowledge, especially about how much money is provided, doesn't really permeate as widely as it needs to. And that said, however, more and more, and polls tend to show this, Americans are moving toward conditioning aid to Israel on supporting the so-called peace process, which has been a farce. And Israel and the lobby have been primarily responsible for ensuring that there has been no two-state solution. And now it's virtually impossible that there could be a two-state solution.
Are claims that the Israel lobby controls both major parties fair or unfair?
It's really a astonishing hegemonic control within the Congress. Everyone in Congress knows when a funding bill or certainly any criticism of Israel comes forth, they know that they even have a reference to it in Congress. It's called an AIPAC vote. And every representative knows when there's an AIPAC vote coming up, and they know that they will be either rewarded or punished, depending on how they vote. And accordingly, because this lobby is so powerful, they have what I call a vice grip on the US Congress.
If the US were to begin to reduce its exposure in the Middle East due to its changing energy needs. Would that commensurately reduce its commitment to Israel?
Yes, I think gradually is the key. It's going to happen, but this is a glacial process, and a lot of that has to do with the power of the lobby. Certainly, the United States, a lot of people have, of course, became very weary of the forever wars in the Middle East, and a lot of that was linked with U.S. support for Israel. On the other hand, Israel continues, especially under Netanyahu, to champion conflict with Iran. So I wouldn't say for sure, especially if the Iran treaty breaks down completely, that the United States is out of the Middle East or out of the Persian Gulf. Certainly the dependence on oil is much less than it used to be. But often the United States has intervened for really irrational reasons, not just for oil.
What would the U.S. do in the perhaps unlikely event that all of their major allies were against Israeli occupation in Palestine?
Well, I think that there are a lot of forces that are arraying against the support that Israel and the lobby have enjoyed for decades. This includes, in fact, liberal Jewish opinion in the United States. Liberal Jews have long been progressive in a number of ways, and many are very fed up with Israeli aggression, the right-wing settler-driven Israeli actions in the Middle East. But as for allies, if you look at the history of votes in the UN, the United States has often, with a couple of its colonies in Pacific atolls, been one of 2 or 3 or 4 votes against censure of Israel versus more than 100 affirmative votes to censure it in the General Assembly, for example. So, and the United States has long had opposition from its allies on its Israel policy. So just the fact that the allies oppose it and the General Assembly opposes it and the UN opposes it doesn't necessarily mean the United States will. And again, that is a result of the pervasive and very powerful influence of not just the largest lobby for a foreign country, but one of the most formidable lobbies, period. I mean, it ranks up with the pro-gun lobby, with the pharmaceutical lobby, with the elderly person's lobby. This is a tremendously large and powerful lobby, and it continues to grow. It's adding more employees, building more buildings, and remains very well financed. So they remain formidable, even despite your question about the allies and their opposition and international opposition and even liberal Jewish opposition.
Mohsen Abbas, the senator that Mick Napier quoted saying it was pretty good value for money, $3 billion, 3.5 billion now. Otherwise, if Israel didn't exist, they'd have to invent it. They'd have to send permanently aircraft carriers and so on. That senator is now President Joe Biden. And I saw the speech that he gave in which he said that. It is pretty good value for money, isn't it? $3 billion a year, and you get a military superpower, an alien presence, as you say, right in the middle of the Arab world. Keep the Arab world divided, stop it ever uniting. Bob's your uncle.
I think from a geostrategic point of view, from an economic point of view, from a political point of view, you really can't fault it. It was genius in a way. They've done it, obviously, having these kind of depots. Literally, Israel, it was an aircraft carrier in the Middle East for America. That's literally what it's been. It has carried out undercover operations, the Mossad, it's done the balkanization routine. It did upset relationships within the Arab nationalist movements and beyond. It, however, has weakened. I think the issue now is that over time, things catch up. Islamic Republic of Iran's scientific and technological advancement, its relationship with China militarily as well as financially, with the Belt Road Initiative, Russia's re-emergence as a power, and this Eurasian rise is a reality. And it's a reality which is fundamentally going to hit at America. You could argue that that would give those Americans weakening their support for Israel a reason to say, no, we need Israel even more than before. In fact, we should invest even more again, because it's our bulwark to preventing the complete dominance of Russia and China, perhaps Iran as well, in the Middle East. So it's, however, not as easily done as said. The fact is that the Americans have suffered military defeats on the ground, with whether it's Hezbollah, the Syrian army itself, or in Iraq with the PMUs. The ISIS alliances, along with the Turkey backup and all the other NATO forces, haven't succeeded in securing a victory in that region for a very long time. They have a $220 billion trade with the MENA region, the Americans. Most of it is actually in the benefit of the Middle East itself. You know, the Israelis have something like 22 billion of exports going to America. Israel is not reliant totally on American aid anymore. It has its own finance. Israel, through its kind of industrial espionage or the actual favors of the Americans, has taken so much technological, arsenal that it has its own massive internal industry and startups, they call them, I think, you know, the big tech startups. Israel is one of the leading forces in the world on this. It's supposed to be the fourth most powerful nation on the planet. So it's not a pushover, but it's up against now a determined resistance at the grassroots level, but also by a very canny political government in that region, Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that we may well have started to see the beginning of the end, because the confidence of that resistance movement is getting stronger by the day, and their victories are giving them that confidence. And you've seen in the latest round of sort of missile exchanges, if you like, in just simply the Palestinian resistance, which is the weakest of all the resistance axis forces, the Israelis were unable to defend their people as they had previously.
Dr. Hada, last word to you. Obviously, does that reassure you in any way? Does it make you feel more optimistic that one day we or our children perhaps will be able to go back to a free Palestine?
Actually, it does. It does. And the events of May, those 11 days in May, exhilarated a lot of us, made us feel that there was a living resistance and it was gaining strength. And the fact that you had uprisings in every area that Israel rules in Israel-Palestine is very significant.
Including inside the so-called Green Line.
Precisely. 48, Jerusalem, Gaza, West Bank, not a single part was left quiescent, as had happened in the past. So that was extremely exhilarating. But then, you see, back to our discussion, I really, there's a question to be asked. Is it, in fact, from the imperial point of view, is it more useful to have a local agent who runs around biffing people and stopping any nascent revolution? Is that actually better than not having that disruptive agent and having a region which is grateful to you by giving it aid, by helping it to develop? It is more at peace. You don't have to pay all this money to your local agent to be disruptive and to create reasons for wars. Wars are
That would be a big call for any president to make, though, wouldn't it? Not least because the local agent has invested a lot of money in your political system.
Of course, and in many ways it's too late, because it was a big mistake to support the creation of something like Israel and believe that it can serve you. And you can see the result. It's a disruptive, aggressive force that causes more problems than it solves.
It wasn't a mistake for the empire, surely. If not for the existence of Israel, President Nasser might have united the Arabs from the Atlantic to the Gulf, and then they would have been a superpower.
Well, if you had been wise, you as the West, and helped these developments, you could then have ended up in a situation of alliance and friendship, which can serve you very well, rather than what you've got now, which is the worst of all worlds. You know, in the end, Israel was created for reasons which were Western problems. They're Western problems. What they did was export their problems to our region. That's unforgivable. In my view, the only way is to take back this creature that your problems created, take it back, and then try and sort it out where you are, not where a Middle East is or where Palestine is. I have every confidence this will come to pass, because this kind of crummy arrangement, shoddy arrangement by suppression and repression and bombing, it doesn't go on working in the end. And I really feel for the first time from the May events that we are seeing something new happening.
This one will run and run. If God gives me breath, I'll be back to talk to you about it next year and the year after that. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة, and you have been a marvelous audience. Thanks for watching.